What we're learning is that these infrastructure revolutions in history take on their own life that we don't anticipate in advance. That was the biggest surprise. This is a list that we made up of all the things that we saw after the fact as we started to emerge with this technology. We're balancing now efficiency now against adaptivity as a time value. We're balancing growth now against flourishing. Flourishing is the nature's time value. We're balancing finance capital. Now we realize it's ecological capital that creates it. We're seeing that that GDP is not as relevant as quality of life indicators in determining the well-being of society. We're balancing corporate conglomerates with high-tech, small and medium-sized cooperatives, SMEs. We're balancing intellectual property rights with open source sharing and knowledge. It's quicker. This goes on and on and on. We didn't see all this at the beginning. These infrastructures take on their own persona. And what I would say is by the late 2040s, if we can move there, the third industrial revolution will have finally morphed into the first of the age of resilience infrastructures for the next couple hundred years. I'm not naive. I'm guardedly hopeful, but I realize this is the biggest crisis we have ever faced. This is an extinction event. I know what's possible. I know what's available. We are there with that. The question will be, will we come up to the challenge quick enough, a younger generation? Will we do the heavy lifting? Will we change our educational system? Will we begin to introduce all of these ideas in academia? Can we begin to encourage a younger generation to be prepared for the new kind of business models?
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today, we have the solutions to our economic and ecological crisis offered by the third industrial revolution to consider. Now, some of you may immediately jump to the conclusion that technology and industrialization is what got us into this mess in the first place. And depending on my mood on any one day, I might well agree with you. But let's face it, there's no turning back the clock on scientific and technological revolutions. So if you can't beat it, then reform it. And many social elements of the digital and internet revolution seem to have started doing exactly that in a quite independent, self-organized way. That said, it has been the campaign and the deep vision of my guest today for more than 40 years to go further than just talking about it, self-organizing, to push beyond political divides by prioritizing life over blind growth and productivity and get big entities like governments and trade federations to really start thinking like this. He is, of course, the economist, social theorist, activist, and author of 21 books, Jeremy Rifkin. His work focuses on the impact of scientific and technological changes on the economy, the workforce, the society, and of course, the environment. And today we're going to be focusing on his new book, The Age of Resilience, his 2014 book, The Zero Marginal Cost Society, and his 2011 book, The Third Industrial Revolution. Now, Rifkin has been an advisor to the leadership of the European Union since 2000. Several other heads of state from Europe, particularly on ushering in this smart green revolution. He's advised the People's Republic of China on building out and scaling up the internet in a sustainable, low carbon economy. And he's currently advising the European Commission on the deployment of the Smart Europe initiative. Now, I wanted to speak to Jeremy about this dream for a compassionate, peer-to-peer, decentralized smart economy, to solve some of these collective problems, and to talk to him about some of the shadow issues ever since I first heard him speak some 10 years ago. So I really can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. Jeremy Rifkin, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thanks for coming on the show. How are you?
I'm fine. Thanks for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Jeremy. I love to start going back to my guest's very first deep questions and reflections, usually sometime between 8 or 12 years old, sometimes earlier. What were your first impressions and reflections about life and the world that may in some way have influenced where you ended up? What jumps out as you look back?
Well, a few things. I grew up in a working class neighborhood in the south side of Chicago, the infamous South Side. And the families there worked in the stockyards and the steel mills and they were police and firemen and whatever. I became aware of class differences fairly quick when I was about 12 or 13, the time you move into puberty. I was a public school, but the next community over was a middle class community. And that was a really kind of an eye opener. I also was fortunate with my mom, way ahead of her times. She was born in 1911, before American women had to vote. She was a self starter. She introduced me to civil rights. She introduced me to proper male female relationships and the importance of gender. She introduced gay couples. I remember two gay men who came over for dinner. She introduced to me all these things in the 1950s that just was not part of the working class environment I was in. She was a big influence on me.
Mm. So, Jeremy, before getting into your new book, The Age of Resilience, I want to talk about two of your earlier books to sort of help set the scene: the Third Industrial Revolution and the Zero Marginal Cost Society. Now, with your permission, Jeremy, because there's so much unique and sort of less known gems in your work that I want to get through in the time that we have, I'm just going to introduce the two big elephants in the room only very briefly, without asking you to present them in detail, partly because I think in the 40 plus years you've been calling out these things, they've now become very widely covered in the press and become really glaringly obvious to anyone who's been paying attention. But also partly because this isn't a politics podcast, so I want to sort of leave that side of it. Now, these two themes are entire conversations in and of themselves, so I just want to focus on the science and the technology that can be used to offer some sort of glimmer of a solution before it's too late. So is that all right, Jeremy?
Yeah, you lead. I'll follow.
Thank you. So the first elephant in the room is the fallout from the first and the second industrial revolution. So fossil fuel combustion-based mechanization, telephony, mass production and distribution that have led to a really dysfunctional economic system that just doesn't track human or ecological well-being, but has exponentially multiplied inequality to ever more absurd levels. And this is often called the 1% or the 99% problem. And it could definitely be argued that the poorest of the world's basic standard of living has improved during that time, but we're just not going to talk about that today. It's just a very long and nuanced conversation. Now, the second elephant in the room is that dysfunctional economic system's unnatural drive for ever greater productivity, growth, efficiency, with no regard for this sort of finely balanced, self-correcting functionality that's built into complex systems like our planet's biosphere, has led to this exponential climate change feedback loop that finally is making us realize that we too are an endangered species. So, Jeremy, with those two elephants firmly in the room, let's introduce this paradigm change and this inkling of a solution that the third industrial revolution could offer if we get it right. And listeners, we're going to be getting into the shadow possibilities if this gets hijacked. I want to start by asking you to talk about the dirty secret behind the dropping productivity and efficiency in the last 20 years that economists don't like to talk about, the zero marginal cost production via the internet that's causing this disruption. What is this dirty productivity secret, and why is zero marginal cost production so disruptive to the old system?
It's both complicated and very simple at the same time. The interesting thing about the third industrial revolution, which is emerging now, is what it does to marginal costs. Marginal costs are very important in our day-to-day economic life. Now, let me back up for a moment and provide a context for this. All right, if we take a look at the great economic paradigm shifts in history, from an anthropological point of view, they all share a common denominator. And that is, at a moment of time, 5 defining technologies will emerge serendipitously, by the way, and begin to converge across a society that changes fundamentally our whole way of life, our temporal spatial orientation, our concepts of economic activity and governance, the way we relate to nature, how we educate our kids. So what are these elements? Number one, new communication revolutions, very important. Number two, new energy regimes. Number three, new modes of mobility and logistics. Number four, new ways of interacting with the waters of the planet, the hydrosphere. When they come together, which is very infrequently in history, they change society in a very fundamental way. And we tend to think that governments create our worldviews. No, our infrastructure paradigm shifts create our worldviews. They determine what you can and can't do. You can have variation, but they determine our temporal spatial orientation, how we organize our economy, how we govern, how we educate our kids, how we relate to nature. For example, if you take the first industrial revolution, all right, in the 19th century in Britain, the communication revolution was steam power printing, no more manual print presses. Then they laid a telegraph system across the British Isles in the last half of the century. Their energy revolution was coal. They had depleted the forest and the peat, so they had to go to coal and develop a steam pump to get the coal out of the ground. The mobility revolution was the railroads, the locomotives. And the water revolution was they were the first modern society since the fall of Rome to put in very advanced water systems, infrastructures, and sewer systems. That shift took us to a completely new dimension. It took us to national markets. It took us to nation-state governance to organize the system. It took us to urban development because of the railroads. And it really changed history. So the first thing I would say is infrastructures determine our worldviews and the way we govern ourselves and organize our economy and our society, not the other way around. That's a big shift from anything that's in any textbook or book in the world. That's different. Then the question then becomes, why is it communication, energy, mobility, logistics, and water, and then the changed environment where you live and work? It's what every organism requires. Every organism in this planet requires a means of communication. It has to have some source of energy thermodynamically to survive in a non-equilibrium state. Number three, it has to have mobility or motility, like plants and cells. Number four, it has to have water. And so our infrastructure revolutions are giant social organisms that bring large numbers of our population together in very integrated, complex, diverse ways to function as a whole. And they change our temporal spatial relationship, our economy, our governance, our society. It's pretty simple, pretty basic, not in any books. Now, that's why I've tried to share that. That's what happens in the real world. So if you look at the 20th century, second industrial revolution was quite interesting. It was the US, and the telephone was the big deal. Alexander Graham Bell came along, we connected the continent. Instant communication. The energy revolution, we struck oil in Texas. We didn't need coal anymore. The mobility revolution, Henry Ford stole the Daimler engine and put out a cheap car. Road, rail, water, finally air transport. The water revolution was the great hydroelectric power dams. We tend to think that was from ancient times. We've had 6,000 years of hydraulic civilization, and the apex was great hydropower electric dams all over the world to sequester the hydrosphere. This took us from urban to suburban life, roads, automobiles, etc. It took us from national markets to globalization. And it took us to global governing institutions like the World Bank and the OECD and the IMF and the UN. That second industrial revolution peaked in the business community governments that I work with. We all know the date. The public does not. It was July 2008. That was the month that oil hit $147 on world markets, a record. The whole global economy shut down in silence. The collapse of the financial market from subprime mortgages 60 days later, that was a Ponzi scheme. It's a little aftershock. Why the earthquake? Everything depends on fossil fuels. It's not just powering your car or heating your home. Synthetic fibers for our clothes, preservatives and food additives, pharmaceutical products, cosmetics, construction material. It's endless. So when the price of oil goes over 80 or 90 a barrel, all the other prices go up. At around 110 a barrel, it shuts down. So we began to realize in the governments I work with, in the industries in our group, that's the key. We're in now the death knell of that second industrial revolution for sure. I don't know of any business leaders or governments that I work with that think we're on the sunrise or even the plateau of the second industrial revolution. So that gets us to where we are now, this third industrial revolution you asked about.
And the dirty secret then is, why is productivity and efficiency dropping since that day?
Well, there's a long history to this. I wrote a book called The End of Work, which was published in 1995 and really kind of jump-started this conversation. This has been a long history that started way back in the 1920s. Because in the 1920s, automation was starting to move in, all right? And what we saw during the whole 1920s, as factories became automated, it reduced the workforce because it was cheaper to put in the machines and eliminate the labor. And even in the late 1920s, before the crash, there was a considerable understanding in the business community that they were letting workers go, but then they didn't have enough of a paid workforce to buy the products they were making. That was the big conundrum. And so Henry Ford said, maybe we better rehire these workers, or who's going to buy my cars? He went to an increase in salary, and he reduced the work day to 8 hours. Some companies followed him, other companies did not, but it didn't make any difference. Automation kept going. During the Depression, they were still putting in technology that was cheaper than the workers, eliminating the workers. And this continued after World War II all the way to today. So how do we keep the whole thing running? We did it by giving out credit. That's why the whole system has been locked into a way of life that just is not doable. So we began in the 1920s with installment buying. So you could buy your car on installment payments because you weren't really working full time or you didn't make enough money. And so you had to buy on installments. After the war, we went into credit cards. And so we kept it going by people increasingly going into debt because they were either not paid enough or they were eliminated in the workforce. And here's where the rubber hits the road. In 2008, when the collapse happened in July because of 147 a barrel for oil, you know what the consumer debt was in the U.S.? It equaled the GDP. The consumer debt equaled the actual GDP. I think at that point it was like 14 trillion. So we kept it going in a way that was completely dysfunctional. And that's the story.
But what about, because the internet sort of starts to come quite heavily into play around about that time, and that brings in this zero marginal cost question.
Yeah.
So what did we start to see self-organizing amongst the young digital generation that led to this sort of disruptive element of the zero marginal cost society that you write about in your book?
Well, the interesting thing is before I wrote that book, there was no conversation. Afterwards, I mean, it's sort of something that the business community kind of understood intuitively, but they never thought about it. I know that seems strange, but they really didn't. And so what was interesting, we first started to see this with solar and wind. I wrote a book called The Hydrogen Economy back in 2000, and we jump-started the hydrogen movement in Europe. And when we did this book, we began to realize that solar and wind were on an exponential falling cost curve. I was already starting. And then we started to ask the question, well, what about efficiencies? There's something strange about this term, okay? We began to see a solar watt used to cost $78 for 1 watt. It's like 40 cents today, all right? Solar and wind, the levelized cost went below the cost of nuclear, coal, oil, and gas in 2019, meaning over a 30-year span, when you look at all the costs, it's now cheaper, way cheaper. And that's the fastest growing technology. And the fixed cost is plummeting. The marginal cost is near zero. That's when I first came across it back in the 1990s. And I said, oh my God, it's going to move that way. The sun and the wind do not send a bill. We've never been invoiced. And it's everywhere and ubiquitous. Coal, oil, natural gas, uranium, huge investments for exploration rights. Then you have to extract it, you have to purify it, you have to move it down the line. It's extremely expensive. Solar and wind is everywhere, it's ubiquitous. So where are we now? It's been since 2000, it's been 24 years later, quarter of a century. It's the fastest growing near zero marginal cost energy in the world.
This sets the scene perfectly for your grand vision of this third industrial revolution that you wrote about 20 years ago, but we're now ready for, because the market is actually in a position to understand that the costs really are convenient. Give us the story. New infrastructure, the Internet of Things, sustainable energy, big data, decentralization, blockchain, open source. Give us a description of your grand vision, and also tell us how we can motivate the key people and organizations to set it up all together at the same time so it kind of works.
We began to have a conversation on the third industrial revolution in 2000. I introduced it, I think, in the first pages of The End of Work in 1995. We were just starting to move into the digital revolution. Then Romano Prodi came to the U.S. He was a president of the European Commission at that time, formerly head of Italy, a friend. He seduced me to come to Europe for the next 20 years, he said. So I did. It was a good move. And when we began to look at it, then we started to realize that that we are into a completely different infrastructure. So the communication revolution, we already saw it happening. That was, of course, the internet. All right. Today, we've got 4.5 billion people on the planet with a little smartphone in the palm of their hands. And that little phone has more computing power than sent our astronauts to the moon. That's near zero marginal cost. All right. And so we saw the we saw the communication revolution, the internet's here. Then we began to take a look at the energy internet when we began to move the 20-20-20 formula to get solar and wind going. And again, we saw the fixed cost plummeting on an exponential curve, the marginal cost near zero. We had some history with this because we saw that's what happened with chips early, computer chips. Now, when they realized at some point that they were doubling the chips and halving the cost, chips and halving the cost, and they realized it was going toward near zero marginal cost, we started to see it with solar and wind. And, solar and wind, today, it's millions of people. Within 20 years from now, 30 years from now, hundreds of millions of homes and offices and parks and rural areas are going to have both small and utility scale solar and wind. And the fixed costs are plummeting, the marginal costs near free, and it's going to be an energy internet. That's the next thing. So we're beginning now to transform our electricity grid so that we can share solar and wind that we don't need. Say we produce the energy in our buildings, the electricity with solar or utility scale wind out on the farms. What surplus we have, we can send it up, and we are doing it now on an energy internet, sharing it using big data, analytics, and algorithms to share that electricity across time zones. Now it's crossing nations and continents, in 20 years across oceans. One of the major companies in our group does the underground cable, so underwater cable. So we're going to begin to share it across the planet in a global energy internet. We introduced that in the Hydrogen Economy book in 2000. So that means that the sun is shining in one part of the world, grab it, store it, and send it. If the wind at night is moving in another part of the world, take it, use some of it, share the rest. And you're using big data, analytics, and algorithms that bring together those two internets, communication and energy. Then the third internet, mobility and logistics. We have electric and fuel cell transport. They're going to be increasingly autonomous on road, rail, water, and air. And they're going to be getting their power for both electric vehicles and long-haul hydrogen transport from the energy internet. All right? And increasingly, those vehicles will be autonomous and have to use big data, analytics, and algorithms shared with the energy internet and the water and the communication internet in order to make this happen. Now those three internets are converging with the fourth internet. That's the newest one, and that's the water internet. We're not running out of water. people are confused because they hear droughts, floods, droughts, wildfires, heat waves, hurricanes. The amount of water on this planet has been here near the beginning. It doesn't disappear. What's happening is it's changing when it comes down and how much and where. Because what's happening with global warming is the hydrosphere is now rebelling totally. The idea that we could sequester the waters of the planet for 6,000 years, that was the ultimate hubris of civilization. The dams and the dikes and the canals and the hydraulics. Well, now the problem is, and this is something I would like to share with everyone. For every 1 degree Celsius that the temperature goes up on this earth from global warming emissions, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, the atmosphere is sucking up 7% more of the precipitation from the oceans and the lakes and the plants into the sky, into the clouds. So you're getting more concentrated precipitation in the clouds and more incredible water events. Atmospheric rivers, blockbuster snows, spring floods, summer droughts, heat waves, wildfires, fall hurricanes. And what's happening is the entire hydrosphere is now saying it's over. It's determined. It always has been the choreographer of life, but now it's determining the future. I'll maybe go into that in more detail with you in the fall when we have when we're going to be putting out some issues on that. So what we've got here is all of that's moving toward low to near zero marginal cost. It makes for some big changes.
Jeremy, sorry just to interrupt on that point. So because the water internet, this is something new that I haven't read about yet. Are you saying that there will be technological solutions that will be able to intervene with this sort of atmospheriization and draw down some of that water using condensation, using a different form of a different methodology?
That's all of what we're going to discuss in the fall. But the water internet's here. So we're moving toward an ancient idea, which is harvesting water in cisterns, but now we're digitizing it. So everyone's going to it's already started. So you're going to be able to collect the water when it comes and harvest it, put it under the ground with microgrids, just like we have energy microgrids now for solar and wind. They're all here now. This is none of that I'm talking about here with you is theoretical. This is what our companies and industries are beginning to do as we develop the plans for Europe, China, and here in the US. So it's just beginning. So you're going to see everyone collecting water just like we're collecting the sun and the wind. But this is what's interesting. It gets to something you alluded to before about why do we have, you sort of suggested, a big split between the rich and the poor, the few and the many. All right? If you look at the nature of infrastructure revolutions, they tell us pretty much how the fruits of those revolutions are distributed. For example, the first and second industrial revolution infrastructures were designed to be top-down and centralized. And they cost a huge amount of money to put in. No monarchy could afford, or rich family, to put in railroad systems and coal across an entire country to store it and move into urban life and locomotives and railroads and telegraphs. It was too expensive. So that meant we had to develop a shareholding corporation, right? So that we have lots of people investing. Well, what happened with that is that we ended up with every sector having to vertically integrate to create economies of scale to return their investments, all right? So it started with fossil fuels. There's a handful of oil companies already at the beginning. And then all the other industries that depend on fossil fuels for all their activity, they have to create the handful of companies that are at the top. Everyone else is marginalized. So here's where we end up. And I should say, take a look at the Fortune 500. I've taught many of these CEOs. I lectured at the Advanced Management Program at Wharton for over 15 years. We bring in presidents of companies, CEOs, for 5 weeks of preparation. And they're good folks, but here's the bottom line. Because of vertical integration to create economies of scale to return investments for these big, heavy top-down infrastructures, we ended up with 500 global companies, Fortune 500. They represent 1/3 of the entire GDP of the world. That's only 500 institutions. And they only have 65 million employees out of a 3.5 billion worker workforce. That's amazing. And the top 8 individuals on that pyramid, their combined wealth equals the accumulated wealth of one half the human beings living on the earth today. The 3 richest people in my country, you know who they are, their combined wealth equals the accumulated wealth of the bottom half of our population in the US. That was the nature of the infrastructure, and it didn't matter whether it was in a capitalist or a socialist country. I'm sorry, and a lot of young people think, well, we think the answer is, that socialism was better at kind of distributing the fruits better, but they both had to have vertical integration. When Russia came in after the Soviet Union, the whole thing was electrifying the infrastructure with centralization. The third industrial revolution is really different. Now, it's true that the first companies that came into it, Microsoft and Dell and Apple and Facebook and Twitter, are centralized, correct? Vertically integrated, because that's what they know. They won't be here in 40 years from now. They won't be here, not in their present form. And Berners-Lee will get the last laugh. I've never met him, but Berners-Lee will get the last laugh. He said, look, I want to create an infrastructure for communication where everyone at the margins can speak directly to each other without a referee in the center, right? He's going to get the last laugh. And here's why. It's all about the data. Remember, I said this system is by its nature distributed. If you own an electric vehicle, you're part of the infrastructure. If you have a hydrogen or electric fuel cell in your home or office or neighborhood, you're part of the infrastructure. If you have solar panels on your roof, you're the infrastructure. If you have wind on your farm, you're the infrastructure. If you have IoT, it's all infrastructure. So what we're talking about is right now millions and soon hundreds of millions, and eventually much of the human race will be producing and sharing their own solar, their own wind. They'll be sharing water where they are. They're going to be sharing mobility and logistics. That's just where it's heading. There's too much data. This is why it's not going to work. So if you have an autonomous vehicle about to crash and you send that data to a remote data center from one of the big centralized companies that we all know about, it's too late. It's a crash. So edge data centers, there are now thousands. There'll be hundreds of millions of them where people connect their own edge data centers in their homes, their offices, their neighborhoods for fluid, agile platforms that can come and go. And this is called fog computing, not cloud computing. And it means the latency factor is just too heavy for big companies. So what I'm suggesting in this is the third industrial revolution infrastructure, which is taking us to a completely different reality where small and medium-sized enterprises and cooperatives and agile ecosystems are the rule of thumb. Some of the big companies will stay, but there'll be aggregators along with these SMEs. It's already started.
And ironically, these conditions that you're talking about are already happening in the minds of the new generation, right? For them, this independence, this sort of vertical independence that we were brought up to strive for them is actually isolation from the wider network. On the contrary, they're already laterally integrating their community, exchanging peer-to-peer across the internet, across social media with no middlemen, open sourcing their knowledge at zero marginal cost on YouTube, on TikTok, seeing themselves as a giant community, as a single species. That should make this transition easier, right?
Well, it's great to hear you say that. Here's the deal, and the first and second industrial revolution, it's always about a zero-sum game. There are winners, there are losers. The internet, as it becomes more distributed, it's all about not that, but it's really about inclusivity. It's about the network effect. The more people in the network, the more people benefit from the network. All right. So as you got to imagine millions, hundreds of millions, and billions of people. It's already millions. This is not going to go away. And they're sharing their communication, their energy, their mobility, their logistics, their water, and their built environment, just as a massive global social organism, but very distributed, very localized, very bio-regional. That's just in the cards. That's what's going to happen. And it's going to happen for a lot of reasons. And we can get into that in a moment. Because climate change is going to change where we live and how we live. And we'll go into that in a little bit if we can. So this is a completely different arrangement. You mentioned efficiency quite a bit. So I first began to talk about that with Ted Howard. We wrote a book called Entropy back in 1980. It was the first book to deal with solar after the first National Academy of Science report. So what is efficiency? Everyone thinks, isn't that what nature's all about? Isn't every species in nature trying to be efficient? No, it's a human invention. In nature, it's adaptivity is the temporal value. Every species, including our own, has myriad biological clocks in our tissues, our cells, our organs that continually adapt us moment to moment to the circadian rhythms, the rotation of the planet every 24 hours, seasonal, tidal rhythms, and circannual rhythms as we move across the sun. That's the temporality of life on this earth. Back in the proto-industrial late medieval age on, this new term came, efficiency. So here's what efficiency is. Efficiency is prying out the secrets of the four key spheres. The key sphere is hydrosphere. That's the choreographer for everything. Without a hydrosphere, you don't have a lithosphere. The soil, the forest, the trees, the plants, the animals. Without the hydrosphere, you don't have an atmosphere, the oxygen. Without the hydrosphere, you don't have a biosphere. So it's trying to sequester greater amounts of those spheres, scientifically and technically, at higher speeds and shorter time intervals to maintain the opulence of one species, ours. Then we wonder why we're in an extinction event. We are less than 1% of the biomass, our little species of the whole world. We're using 24% of the photosynthesis, net primary production. We're going to be using 40% in 20 years from now. Not doable. Well, what we're beginning to see is a really basic shift. Then there's the question of productivity. There's no such thing as productivity in nature. There's regenerativity, not productivity. It doesn't exist. It's a made-up term. There's no such thing as growth in nature. It's flourishing in nature. It flourishes or it doesn't. Finance capital is just a weak derivative. The only capital is ecological capital, net primary production. And this is where John Locke and Adam Smith just took us down the wrong path. It was John Locke who came in and said, look, up to that point in time in history, we had proprietary relations in the medieval and feudal era. Nobody actually owned property. You just had responsibilities for certain parts of the God's creation, depending on whether you were a noble or a serf or whatever. But John Locke came around and said, look, nature is waste. That's his exact words. Oh, nature is waste. And he said the only reason it becomes valuable is when human labor is added to it, making something of wealth. Otherwise, it would be worth nothing. These are his exact words. And this took us from propriety relations to property, okay? And so that was a big movement forward. And then Adam Smith just chimed in and said, every individual is pursuing their own self-interest and doesn't really give a damn about the public interest. But in pursuing their self-interest, it equals an advantage to society, which is not true. So there's so many things changing. And I think the young people are beginning to get it. We can hopefully talk about the Gen Zs in a bit.
I wanted to get into your new book on this because The Age of Resilience, your new book, it's called The Age of Resilience, Reimagining Existence on a Rewilding Earth. You talk about this new digital native generation as having a different point of view. They're as having eco-consciousness or biophilia, as it's been called, and potentially becoming an empathic civilization, which for a long time you've written about is very much more in our nature than the dying economic system you've just been describing that our society has had to adapt to. Tell us about this biophilia that's starting to shine through in this young generation and the true resilience, as you put it, that such a move back to an empathic society could help bring back resilience that is quite literally part of the natural self-correcting system that we've born out of.
Well, I spent about 9 years on a book that was published back around 2010 called The Empathic Civilization. It was a 650-page book. I wrote it for myself, frankly. I'd written on empathy over the years, but I realized that that's a basic dynamic that's really interesting in how we become who we are. I want to come back to that in a moment on that.
We're a collaborative species.
But we are a collaborative species. But let me talk about two things that are really fascinating that when all of the people listening to this podcast with you they'll never forget what I'm about to say. One is a new pursuit at the National Institute of Health, which is our grandiose scientific body in the US. It's 2.5 blocks out of my window at my office. So the NIH has launched a new program, which is incredible. It's called the Human Microbiome. And the EU is now joined, and Japan, Korea, and a few other countries. And this changes the whole way we perceive our being on this planet. What the NIH is saying to us is that each of us, and everyone listening to you and I today, are an actual ecosystem, not a metaphor. Let me give some examples. For example, we tend to think in the modern age, the industrial age, each of us is an autonomous agent. And we extract nature into ourselves for utilitarian purposes, and then that's it. Well, that's just not the way it kind of really exists in the biological world. They're saying that, for example, our body is changing every day in every part of our body. Our skeleton, we kind of think that once we're mature in puberty, that's the skeleton. It's replaced every 10 years. Our liver is replaced every year. Our stomach cells every month. And then at every moment, we're taking elements out of the other spheres into our tissue cells and bodies. We take the water from the hydrosphere, and we're 60% water. In the womb, we're 70 to 90%. And those molecules go in our cells, tissues, and organs. And guess what? The atoms in those molecules don't disappear. They leave us and go somewhere else. All right. Then we take the minerals of the lithosphere, the mountains. Those mountains are not static; they're constantly changing, and so the waters degrade the mountains, like Grand Canyon. And when they degrade the mountains, all the minerals in those mountains go into the ground. They become the sediment for the soil. Then the plants, are in that sediment. They take up the minerals. Then the animals eat the plants, and then those minerals come into our body, where they stay for a moment of time. And then those atoms and they go somewhere else. The phosphorus in my teeth, that came from a mountain. And after in my life, it goes somewhere else. So we are constantly taking from the various realms, the atmosphere, the oxygen, the same thing. So we are a ecosystem enmeshed in other ecosystems. Well, you know what? It's a powerful message for a young generation that's feeling biophilia. All these young kids, I didn't get it until I was in Milan, and I sat down with 3 of the millennials responsible for Friday for Future, and I finally understood what was happening. All these Gen Z young people were coming out on these Friday for Future demonstrations, 141 countries, millions of kids, young people, young adults, and they were calling for a climate emergency. And I thought, that's good, they need to. But then I realized when I talked to these 3 Gen Zs, it's actually more profound. This is the first generation in history, and with some of the millennials too. This is the first generation in history that actually sees itself as a species endangered. It sees its fellow creatures as part of the family. That's biophilia. And this is extraordinary. So all of the other things that have kept us from each other, our political orientations, our religious affiliations, our tribal and blood ties, all that's still here. But they all see themselves as an endangered species. This is such a huge shift, along with the NIH saying we are each an ecosystem. If only young people would spend less time on 1-minute TikToks, I like TikTok, but they need to step back and have a much more engaged, thoughtful look at what's happening around us, because all of this changes dramatically how we think of ourselves. Instead of adapting nature to us, we now have to go back to what we used to do and adapt us to nature, but with much more sophisticated neo-animism, new science, which we should talk about, new technologies, etc.
But isn't it ironic, Jeremy, that it takes a threat to the entire existence of the species, an existential threat, to reignite the empathy that makes you feel like you're one species? I find that so ironic that when we're fine, and this brings me on to my next question, when we're fine, we don't worry about it. We don't think about it. We're not empathic. And this empathy question brings me back to this Hegel quote that you often mention. that periods of happiness are the blank pages of history, right?
In any of these news into journalism, you're the first one that's actually mentioned that. It's such a critical thought. Thank you.
Well, there's a lot of philosophy on this program. The best times of our civilizations are not remembered. They're not championed. They're not celebrated. They're not used for education. We're always talking about the doom and the gloom and learn from the danger. And it reminds me of this anecdote that we covered on the show in the Science of Meditation episode with Shauna Shapiro. And the story is the Dalai Lama challenging the neuroscientist Richard Davidson, saying, listen, if you really want to understand mental health, all this money, NIH, all these organizations pouring millions of dollars into cancer, into human health. And the Dalai Lama says, just study the neuroscience of compassion, not just the mental health problems, the downstream, problems from all of this terrible management and lack of empathy. And in the studies that challenge inspired Davidson, he showed that there are remarkable changes in the brain for those who practice compassion. Now, could this be part of the problem for them from the first two industrial revolutions, Jeremy, that the mindset required to live in such a competitive, dog-eat-dog, isolating and unnatural economic system has led to a sort of positive feedback loop that's further isolated us from that mental state of empathy, from nature's self-correcting, complex systems, interconnecting function.
Mm-hmm.
They're naturally self-connecting, like you said. They don't think of efficiency. They don't think of productivity. They naturally self-correct for their best personal functioning, biological functioning. Is this sort of disconnection from that what's got us so out of whack in the first place?
It's both complicated and so simple. And that is so. Maybe 40, 45 years ago, I read a quote from George Frederick Hegel, the great philosopher, kept with me for decades. He said, happiness are the blank pages of history because those are the periods of harmony. And I thought, what the hell is he talking about? Over and over, I kept in my mind for years. And it finally dawned on me. If you are a fan of history and read history books, what do you read about? All the traumatic experiences in history because they leave an indelible stamp because they're so out of the ordinary. And that is, you have the genocides and the marauding armies, and you have the earthquakes, and you have all of these things. And they are so impressive because they're unusual that history seems to relate to those in very significant ways. But happiness is the blank pages of history. It's the periods of empathy. We are by nature a cooperative species. Let me share another really powerful message for the young people, I hope, that listen to your podcast. A number of years ago, the Smithsonian Institution, our great anthropologists here in Washington, Smithsonian Institution, they did a study along with New York University, and they asked a question: how did human beings survive over history? This spindly little creature on two legs, not very strong, not very powerful. How the hell did we survive? The old story that you and I grew up with is 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, we emerged, in the Rift Valley of Africa. Nice climate came in 10,000 years ago. About 200,000 years ago, we emerged. And then we walked out of the forest onto the grasslands and savanna, and then we settled around the world, and that's the end of the story. When the Smithsonian went back and looked at the geological record, they said, oh my gosh, we got it wrong. What they found in the geological record is that when hominids, our ancestors, emerged 800,000 years ago, later Neanderthals 300,000, 400,000 years ago, then Homo sapiens 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. We still have Neanderthal genes in our gene pool. That 800,000 years represented one of the most extreme changes in climate in history. Because what happens is our planet tilts. And sometimes it tilts closer to the sun, and sometimes it tilts away from the sun. All right? So about 800,000 years ago in the geological record, it tilted. And what happened when it tilted is it created a scenario over 800,000 years in which we had 100,000 years of ice age, 10,000 years of warming. 100,000 years ice age, another 10,000 years of warming. Another 100,000 years of ice age, another 10,000 thousand years of warming. This has gone on for 800,000 years until the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of the Holocene 10,000 years ago. So the Smithsonian researchers said, how the heck did we survive this little creature with all this? And here's what they came up with, not too difficult. The biggest neocortex, really big brain. The ability to have language so that when we explore and have knowledge, we can share it and pass it on. All right. Then we have an opposable thumb and a lot of dexterity in our fingers to be able to mold, manipulate, and create tools. And then finally, because we have a big brain, we also cooperate. And that's because they didn't have that back then, but that's because we have empathy in our neurocircuitry. It's not something up here. It's all throughout our body. These are mirror neurons. We know that we think elephants may have them because they can identify themselves in a mirror. We're not sure about dolphins and dogs, but we have empathy in our neurocircuitry, so we cooperate. And this is a strong suit. So this is a powerful way of saying if we could adapt in that 800,000 years to long periods of ice ages and shorter periods of warming, we can do this again. It's a very powerful message to a younger generation. So the first thing is that we are biophilic by nature, and we see ourselves as a species and our fellow creatures as part of the family. That's good. The second part is that we are a creature that is able to share knowledge, and we have empathy, which allows us to cooperate. Now, there are times when empathy inflates and then it totally collapses. There are times when we have empathic extension and then terrible things we do to each other. And that's something we have to get used to. And the reason that happens, there have been several empathy shifts in history. This is at least my thoughts on this and what I laid out in the Empathic Civilization book. Forager hunters had empathy, but it was always prescribed to their blood ties and kinship groups. If you were another human group, maybe in another valley, maybe you were treated well, maybe not, all right? Because the empathy was biological to their tribal group. When we went to the great hydraulic civilizations, all right, before Christ, all the great axial religions formed then. Was that an accident? Judaism, Taoism, Hinduism, Confucianism, all of they developed at the same time. What happened is our empathy then extended as we moved toward these great hydraulic civilizations. We brought large numbers of people together as a social organism, and they had to have a new empathic identification. It was to their religion. So if you look at first generation Christians in Rome, they were coming in from all over the empire. They were alone with 1 million people in Rome. They didn't have their local deities. And Christ became their father figure in the first century after Christ. And when they would meet each other in Rome with the garments on, they would kiss each other on both cheeks and say, hello, brother, hello, sister. Europeans still do that. And so there was religious conscience, but if you were in another religion, then you might have been the enemy. You follow me? So we had a broader empathy, but there were also a lot of struggle between different religious affiliations. I'm not going to go through all of it, but if you go up to the industrial age, the nation state created a new way to have empathy. Nation states were imaginaries. When they came along, they brought lots of small subcultures together and created a common language, common education. They created common heroes, and a lot of it was fictional. And eventually, within a few generations, the French people began to see France as their fatherland, or Germany as their motherland. And they would empathize with each other, but they would kill, if they had to, against someone who wasn't part of their motherland or fatherland. And so that was an empathic movement, but it also created its own other. Today, what's really interesting is the young people have gone beyond all that. They're thinking as a species. I don't know if it'll work, but I want to say to them, it's so powerful. You see yourself as a species. You see your fellow creatures as the family. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be other historical empathic movements that are going to fight it off. There are still religious wars being fought as I speak with you today. There are tribal wars being fought at this hour. There are ideological wars being fought right now, everywhere. So we need to begin to make a great shift. We don't have to give up our religions. We don't have to give up governing. We don't have to give up our relationships, blood relationships. But to see them in the larger context would be where we need to go, especially now, because we're in an extinction event.
And maybe the question here is, and I think maybe it's more than ironic, maybe it is actually evolutionary, that this challenge that comes with existential risk does bring that coming together as a single species. There is that sense of like, right now we really need to work together to survive. Maybe that's going to be part of the solution. The question for me is perhaps a technological one, because the technological change is so fast that maybe our adaptive sort of complex system evolution just isn't adaptive enough to adapt that fast. And we'll just have to wait and see if we do make it past the civilizations that presumably have all over the universe wiped themselves out with their technology. Now, I just want to change gear because I want to move to a second important part of the conversation, because as positive as all these solutions sound, you are a realist. You're not a utopian. So you know that at every turn in this transition, there is a shadow waiting to hijack this fantastic process. And strangely, it's a non-human one, a purely legal entity, the corporation. But we'll come back to that because we've already touched on it. If we have time at the end, I've got a question I want to ask about that. So I want to raise a couple of important dangers that I see that I think face us that could potentially not only block the transition that I think is already well underway, but it could also hijack it for these sort of old world neo-colonial interests that have become so dominant, as you explained with the pyramid analogy earlier. Now, I'm sure you've got some excellent strategies to defend us against this, as you always do, Jeremy. So I really want to get your view on these. The first shadow, and I think perhaps already the most important, is the ongoing crisis of the eroding of the commons. The commons, a word that I think a lot of young people probably don't even know what it is. The very few of them are left, which continues with this relatively new concept of big data, which you touched on earlier. Now, I see big data as the key liberating factor that allows members of the general public to market and to promote their products and services directly to each other at this sort of zero marginal cost through the internet. Ironically, not even our own preferences and collective demographics are a common. The tech infrastructure of the internet that records that data has been built by big tech companies like Microsoft, Meta, Huawei, Google. It'd be interesting to hear. You've said that they're on board with your ideas. I'd be interested to hear how that pans out. This big data that we're just giving away more and more voluntarily in our own lives belongs to these platforms as soon as we share those preferences on there. Now, surely this is a big spanner in the vision, because if we always have to pay to get access to our own big data in order to target peer-to-peer selling, that ups our marginal costs. It undermines the reality of a truly sharing economy. Is there a way to democratize this monopoly on big data, or is it just a fool's dream to get it back and make it a common again?
Well, let me go into this without great detail, because there'll be more discussion of this in the fall. But let me go into this somewhat. There's some things going on now that are very, very dynamic, but they may succeed or they may not. You're right. I'm a realist in the sense that we know where we can go. Everything I've talked with you about today is happening. The question is, will it scale or will it fail? And do we have enough time? Is time running out on the clock? We are seeing a shift in the regions that I work with, in the EU, China, US, and elsewhere. We're seeing a shift from geopolitics to biosphere politics. We are seeing that. It's just starting, mainly the younger generation. The geopolitical world was really all about protecting a fossil fuel-based civilization. Lots of people died to do that. Millions and millions of people died in wars around fossil fuels. But we're now starting to shift to biosphere politics. The younger generations are beginning to see we live on one planet, and our well-being or lack thereof depends on how well we integrate ourselves with all the other agencies. It's very complicated, but I would say that we still think in the age of progress genre that nature out there is passive resources. They're not, they're life sources. And we tend to think that out there are structures and objects. They're not, they're patterns and processes. The mountain is changing every moment. The lithosphere is changing every moment. These are patterns and processes and flows. The butterfly effect is every instant. Every time any one of us does anything, it intimately impacts everything else. And this is not esoteric. And our indelible imprint of everything you and I and everyone does is there forever and changes everything. But the Asian traditions are a little bit ahead of on this, because if you look at the Asian philosophies and theologies, they're very different in the West. In the West, we go with the book of Genesis. The Lord puts Adam and Eve in the garden, tells them not to eat the apple. And then, of course, Eve, they always pick on the woman. She ate the apple, according to Genesis. And the Lord kicks them out of the garden. He says, you're going to have to work by your toil now, but I shall give you a gift to Adam. You can have dominion over all of my creation. That caveat and all of its various mandates, all the way up to the age of progress, is what's taken us to an extinction event. If you look at the Asian philosophies and religions, in theory, they've also strayed in practice. All of those religions and philosophies are based on we are nature. We are harmonizing with our fellow creatures. Our individual being is always relational to the other, which is all of the world that we live in, the environment, and nature. Have they strayed? Yes. But is it in the cultural DNA across Asia? Absolutely. They got to get that back. To our credit, in the Western world, it was the Europeans who created and developed ecology as a science. It was America in the 20th century that put in the first national parks to preserve the wild. It was Silent Spring, the publication of that book that brought the environmental movement in Earth Day here. It was the Green Parties, which I worked with in Europe, Germany, Italy. So, there's a lot of things cooking, but the key here is we are beginning to move from geopolitics to biosphere politics, and the reason this is happening is the climate disasters don't give a crap about geopolitics or political boundaries. They affect ecosystems, the floods, the droughts, the wildfires, the heat waves. They're taking down the entire infrastructure of this planet. It's all a stranded asset. That's both the biggest crisis in history and the biggest opportunity, because we have to remake the entire infrastructure, communication, energy, mobility, logistics, housing in 3 generations. The biggest opportunity in history, but it's also a moment that we need to either get through or we won't make it. Having said that, when we take a look at climates, they affect ecosystems. So what's happening? Something called bio-regional governance. It's actually happening, where governments are sharing common ecosystems across their sovereign boundaries. We have the first 2 in the US. This is the one place where we're ahead. We have a bio-regional governance in the Northwest Pacific. It's the 5 northwestern US states and 5 provinces and territories of Canada for 30 years. They commonly share that ecosystem and they steward it as a commons, as Eleanor Ostrom would say, because they know that's their future. Then there's the Great Lakes and Laurentian bioregion. Those 5 lakes are 20% of all the remaining fresh water on the entire Earth. Shows you where we're at. The amount of water per capita today is half what it was for our population 50 years ago. We're in big trouble. But they have now the 8 US states, the 2 Canadian provinces that share those lakes. They are in a commons, and they can't do anything unless it maintains that commons for future generations. It's strict. Both of those regions would be around the 5th largest economies in the world. All right. Now, China, where I work, they've introduced through the ecology ministry and 8 other ministries, the 8 ecosystems of China. In Europe, we've got 1, and that is Catalonia has joined with France, and the Occitania region and the Pyrenees are all one, and Balearic Islands, one bioregion, ecoregion. This is going to happen all over the world, not because it's some theory, it's survival and reestablishing ourselves in a new way. Because climate disasters are so spectacular, everyone has to come out. Everyone has to be involved. because even with military coming in to rescue and restore, it's not enough. So what people are learning is they have to be responsible for their local bioregions. So that's one big deal. The other big deal is that we're moving to glocalization. It's actually happening. Not globalization, glocalisation. And this gets back to zero marginal cost, near zero, never zero. And that is because the cost is moved towards zero, it favors a complete shift in the business model. I'll give you an example. Let's take 3D printing. Okay, the way we did industrial technology for the first and second industrial revolution was called subtractive manufacturing. You make a car, you build a house, and you have to whittle down all the materials to get to the final product, right? So if it's a house, you get rid of some of the bricks, not all the glass can be used, whatever. Additive manufacturing, 3D printing is quite different. With additive manufacturing, you have software, you take a feedstock, it can be cement, but that's too much CO2, but now they're working on things like clay. So I'll give you an example. There's a guy named Cucinelli, he's an architect in Italy. He took clay, which is what we've used for buildings for most of history, along with thatch roofs, etc. Yep. And so he heats up the clay. The software then tells the clay to pour out an entire building. You can do it in 1-2 days. Zero emission, near zero emission, passive, can deal with resilience, etc. They're now doing this with bridges and wind turbines and shelters and machines. So why is this glocalization? It takes us from seller-buyer markets to provider-user networks. This is all stuff we're working with because we're doing this in reach. It's not enough. So what does that mean? Cucinella, that architect, can take his software and he can then set up a provider-user network and a licensing agreement with a developer in the Philippines. And then she can download that software and she can print out as many buildings as she likes under that license and pay a fee. No more globalization with ocean traffic and air traffic, which is going to be more problematic because of climate change, for sure. Now, try to imagine these provider-user networks at near zero marginal cost all over the world. This is already happening. The question is not whether the technology is there and moving and ready. It's whether we have enough time, and that's where the problem comes in. It's old politics. It's old political interests. It's old regulations, codes, and standards. It's all these interests that are just now giving up. Either young people are starting to give up, and the older generation that's wedded to the old models doesn't want to move. That's the big problem.
Now, you mentioned Microsoft earlier, being on board with some of your innovations. You know, they're an example of a company holding an enormous amount of this big data. Sorry to come back to my original concern about big data. If it seems to me that the big data is central to the vision of a peer-to-peer society, of a decentralized society, because we as consumers, as individuals, as local communities trying to operate what you're talking about, we need access to that big data for free. That needs to be a common. Now, is that a fool's dream, or is that something that you could take to Zuckerberg? I heard that Zuckerberg recently, just amazingly, completely out of the blue, made one of his AI engines completely open source. Nobody expected that. I mean, is there a way to get big data back as a common?
I'll have more to say about this in September when we put out the new book. But
Jeremy, what is happening? What is happening in September? There's so many things that are coming in, and it's a new book, right?
Yeah.
Tell me what it is.
It'll be out in the major languages in September. But let me just deal with this in a little bit here, a teeny bit. When we see climate disasters at the local level, they are going to be handled with data from the local level. And that means that right now, edge data centers, they're everywhere. We're putting edge data centers across the world. We're putting IoT sensors in the wild to monitor our ecosystems in our four major spheres. We're putting it in the agricultural fields with precision farming. We have IoT sensors in factories and homes and smart businesses, but they're localized. And because of the fog computing,
local governments will have to pay for that data. They will have to pay the tech companies for that data, surely.
No. They will edge data centers. Your data is all collected locally. You don't have to rely on those big data centers at all. You just have to be able to take those edge data centers and collect them in ways that they can be fluid, and then we change. This is all happening. None of that's theoretical.
That hardware is going to be owned by local government,
already here,
not by large corporations.
Well, there's other things too. I don't want to get into too much detail, but take a look at, for example, big data with big companies like Microsoft and Apple. All right. So we already know that they use a huge amount of fossil fuels, right? Energy, a huge amount of energy. It can be fossil fuels, but it's just enormous. But there's another problem with them. They use a huge amount of water. This is the water footprint that's as impressive as the fossil fuel footprint. And the amount of water they're using is just going up through the roof. It's going to be as serious as the fossil fuel issues. And the fact is, for example, let's say you're on a chatbot AI, all right, and you're chatting and you're getting your questions to AI. And now we have millions of people. Pretty soon, hundreds of millions. Maybe in 20 years, billions of people. Guess what? For every 30 or 40 responses you get from the chat, that's one bottle of water. Did you hear what I just said? Magnify that to billions of people conversing every day. We're running out of groundwater. The entire planet is now tilting because we've taken all the groundwater out because we never dealt with it correctly. And that's changing the distribution of the planet and is taking us into an extinction event. So there are so many things. That doesn't mean we won't use AI, but it's going to have to be used for infrastructure, mostly. I'm not opposed to the virtual worlds in some ways because there will be times that we'll have to be indoors and times that will have to be outdoors. And but if we hide away from the planet we live in, we are doomed. If we go into this ridiculously sophomoric metaverse and that's our way of life, we won't make it because we cannot corner ourselves out from the world around us. It's there. It's big. And what we were learning, especially young people, this planet is much more powerful than we ever thought. Our species is much smaller and not significant. The hydrosphere is rewilding us. So we need to use this technology, much of it in infrastructure locally, and we have all the technology there. That's why I wrote the Age of Resilience book. I wish more people had read it in the United States, and the Asian countries read it, and some of the European countries. The next book will deal with the next part. There's 3 books of that series, and they're all based on what's really happened, none of it theoretical. But I'm only guardedly hopeful that I know we're running out of time. And I'm not suggesting we're ever going to go back to where it was. This is a new world. But remember, we're the most adaptive species. And remember, we are biologically designed to be nomadic. All right? There's going to be a lot of things occurring. And this is just the beginning of a conversation you and I are having. We'll have a conversation again in the fall, if you like. But these are things that need to be introduced because the younger generation can take this conversation, this beginning of a story, and move it forward. But they have to do their homework. They have to not rely on 3-minute little spots on the internet and social media. If they don't do that, we're doomed. But if they do take responsibility for their local regions, we know that works. We have juries in the United States. People say, well, you don't want to have just the common people making decisions on life and death, right? Well, we have a jury system. And we take thousands of American citizens have to be part of the pool every year. And then randomly, you have 12 people on a jury. And they have to come up with a unanimous verdict on the most complicated cases, not just criminal, but civil cases and economic cases. And they tend to do really well. So we always say, well, the people are too stupid. Well, they actually do very well. So if we can have juries there, we should be able to move to the idea of having citizens' juries where everyone has their responsibility, and this is in the Age of Resilience, in a moment of time, to be called up and to take part in decisions that affect their bioregion and their commons. But they have to be educated from grade school on.
We're going to come back to education in a minute, Jeremy. So sorry, okay. I'm sorry to push you on this point. Then do you see a day where, again, the crisis is so important that these huge companies that have rolled out the internet's hardware and have been collecting big data for the internet's business model, which I'm about to ask you about, do you see one day where eventually they will turn that back over to those local communities for the necessary needs of the kind of infrastructure you're talking about? Do you see them turning that over for free?
No, but I can give you our past history with this because back 20 years ago, whatever it was, 2007, I put together the elements of the EU Parliament called the 20-20-20 formula. And then we worked with the Commission. We were really 20-30-20. We compromised on 20-20-20. And that meant that started everything. That means 20% increase in energy efficiency. They should have meant aggregate efficiency. 20% reduction in global warming emissions. 20% increase in underwriting the beginning of solar and wind. All right. So that began a process which is where we are here now. And so these things can happen, but the question is, do they happen fast enough? There are 11,000 mayors that have signed up for the climate agreements. You go and talk to these mayors, and they're really nice people. They show you their 10 electric buses, their 5 LEED buildings, and their bike paths. They're all pilots. And here's the irony of it. $11 trillion have flooded out of fossil fuels because it's a stranded asset. The exploration rights, the extraction of the fuels, the purification of them, moving it down the line. They're stranded assets. 11 trillion because they won't amortize out. And they're still building natural gas power plants knowing that they will never amortize out because the current CEO doesn't care because his or her watch is only a couple of years. All right. So what's happened is I spent a lot of time with banks, the major insurance companies. We spent some time with pension funds. There's this huge pool of money that's gotten out. Pension funds have gotten out because they don't want their workers, to end up without having their savings. Insurance industry is moving out because they have to insure all of these stranded assets, right? So you got 42 trillion in pension funds. That's the workers' money. Karl Marx would never have understood that. Actually, the workers are the capitalists, but they just don't control it. Now we're going to do that. Then you have also the insurance companies. And you know what they tell me? I meet all the time. We have them in our group. They're saying, where are the scaled projects? We're getting pilots. The money's there. The market's there. The green bonds are there. We need government to shift. We need a younger generation going into city councils and mayors and governors and premiers and ministers. And we need them going into the schools and the universities. And we need interdisciplinary academic exercises. And we need complex adaptive social modeling. There's all of these new sciences that are there. They're moving.
Yeah.
So if I had a magic wand, I'd say, my God, it'd be great if we had the Gen Zs, the young millennials and Gen Zs move forward, do their homework, and begin to move from protest to, and they are, some of them, to not just helping with local bioregional reemergence, but in really changing the dynamic.
It's great to hear that coming from you, that the market is actually leading this change, and institutions will always be slow, dragging their heels. But the fact that the market itself, that's a really good sign. Okay.
Well, I mean, it's outrageous. I would say this: I wonder what a CEO of a gas company or a coal company, a nuclear company says to their kids when they come home. All the water that's used, all the energy. What are they saying to their children? Really, I'm an elderly guy, but I think of the 20-year-olds that are just having families, the 25-year-olds. What is this? What is the business community saying? Now, a lot of the business community that we work with, they're on it. There's a lot of the top people. We have a global group of architects and urban planners and folks in electricity, energy, mobility, logistics, all these industries, but they're a small group, but they're the ones that really are doing this, and we know it works. We've seen it in places like Haute de France, where we've been there for 10 years. And we know it works because communities come together and they make it work, not us.
So, Jeremy, next shadow issue, sticking with the risks here. The very business model of the internet itself it's been called out quite a lot in the last 8-10 years. Called out, for example, by ex-Google analyst Tristan Harris in 2016, which he then went on to make into a fun, sort of awareness-raising documentary, The Social Dilemma, identifying that we, the consumers, were the product, not the consumers. That manipulative, addiction-forming internet applications were being developed to maximize engagement and thus advertising revenues. That social media, the world's first large AI experiment, interestingly, the original funding for that came from the US military's R&D agency, DARPA, as did for the internet. That this technology was being used to collect big data solely for marketing and large modeling purposes, and not to enhance the peer-to-peer network that it had been sold to us. Oh, wow, this is this wonderful, horizontal, integrated way of working peer-to-peer. So, Jeremy, how can we ensure that the freedom of information exchange on the internet that your great vision relies on, that naturally enforces the transparency and can represent even the poorest of demographics in their sort of peer-to-peer business operations, when its algorithms are just optimized only for advertising revenue? And how do we level the information ecosystem playing field when we're sort of trying to make way for this sharing economy?
We don't have to force it. It will happen. And the reason it's going to happen is that when local regions are confronted, and now it's every region of the world, then they're scared. They're saying, I'm on with presidents of countries all the time. Just yesterday, they're scared to death. The floods, the droughts, the wildfires. There's no more water, or there's too much. And it's terrible right now. It's going to get worse. When that happens, they rely on their local regions to come together. And this is where all of the false ideas that we're getting and all of this stuff on the internet, which is making up stories, it won't make any difference, because when you're at the local region, it's person to person. All the stuff that you pick up on the social media will be irrelevant, because if you're local, everybody is a family, and they're seeing the floods, the droughts, the heat waves, the wildfires, and they have to take responsibility in their local bioregion, not just a community, but whole ecoregions. And that's why you're going to see a new trust based on the commons. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because that's the only way they're going to be able to figure out what to do. And it requires people trusting each other face to face. But it has to go along with preparing a younger generation from grade school on up to think in terms of the planet as a living system. You know what 2 to 5 year olds dream about? When kids are born, they have a natural biophilic sense. They've done studies. Now, what do the little kids when they're 2 to 5 dream about? Most of their dreams, the majority of their dreams, are about little animals because they identify with them. They get to school, they say, no, those are resources. Okay? Those are not life sources, those are resources. So it has to go along with educating differently at the local and regional level. There is no global way to address local ecosystem dynamics. Commons are coming. They are definitely coming. Whether they will be in time, hard to say. Whether there will be a lot of backlash from the existing second industrial revolution infrastructure, hard to say. Whether a younger generation of Gen Zs and young millennials can graduate to the next stage of their development, because they're going to have to do this, and go from protest and small efforts, which are good, at bringing back nature, which is admirable, to also thinking about the bigger picture from the point of view of their bioregion. But let's not over-romanticize this. This requires technology, but it's an enlightened technology. I'll give you an example. Our science goes all the way back to Plato, all the way back to Immanuel Kant, all right? So Plato gave us deductive reasoning. Kant gave us inductive reasoning. They both missed the point. I mean, the idea that Plato had was, there are perfect forms that only exist in a non-material, non-temporal realm. And everything we do on planet is just kind of a forgery of the real forms that exist. For example, you can conceptualize a perfect triangle, but you'll never see it. You conceptualize perfect love, but you'll never see it. The concept is not temporal or spatial. Nuts. But all the the footnotes to Plato all the way to the modern era stuck with us. Then Francis Bacon came along, a very interesting guy, actually. And he created what we call inductive science, that we can pry nature's secrets toward our well-being. And he called nature a common little harlot. We will shake her to her foundation. That's the founder of modern science. And so we tend in the modern world to see deductive reasoning of extracting the secrets of nature. There's another approach to science. It emerged in the late 19th century. It was called pragmatic science, pragmatism. And that was John Dewey, Mead, Pierce. These four guys came out and they said, look, the planet's moving all the time. It's changing every moment. It's alive. And everything is really patterns and processes that are interacting in ways that are really unpredictable. We can anticipate what it's doing. That's abductive. And then we can adapt. Anticipate and adapt. Instead of try to pry the secrets out, purloin, sequester, and consume. So there's a new approach to science called complex adaptive social ecological systems modeling. I call it CASES because it's too long. CASES. We mentioned it in the Age of Resilience book. It's here. It's happening. It's got to go faster. It's just starting. So there's all of these promising things that are emerging within the academic community, within the engineering and technical community, within the business community, new ways of organizing our day-to-day commerce and trade. It's all emerging. And it's just a question of can we break through here?
But Jeremy, sorry to push you on the business model of the internet point. It's fun. All of the things you're mentioning are so important, and they'll all be referenced in the show notes, listeners. But to push you on this point, surely the Internet of Things, data-led, whether it be local or not, is all going to be operated through the internet. If the internet itself, as a portal, is being run on again, broken business model that is drawing in people's attention into the wrong things, where we have algorithms artificially amplifying the wrong data that only maximizes engagement rather than brings to the fore the very, very kind of education that you're advocating. Surely the fact that all of these technologies are going to be very much embedded in the internet, surely we're going to need to face that shadow at some point in order to make sure that this local operation is not dirtied by this completely broken business model.
This is where I'm guardedly hopeful here, because we're actually seeing what works and doesn't work as we deploy these infrastructures in various regions. We've actually seen the successes and failures over a period of time now. It's been since a little after 2000, it's been about 20 years. We're now starting to see it. And what I would say to you is that bio-regional governance is not just a term. Glocalisation is not just a term. We have seen when we've been in these regions that, let's take Haute-de-France, okay? Let's take Haute-de-France. That's the region of Macron and Le Pen. That's their region, all right? So the premier was a socialist, came to me and he said, would you do a plan for us, for the region? We'd like to have a plan. We're the Rust Belt, but we're the major industrial region. We're 10% of the population. Can you do something? I said, absolutely not. Waste of your time, a waste of my time. And I meant that. And he was surprised. He said, why? Because we don't do a plan for you. If we do a plan for you like the big consulting organizations, you'll have one pilot project, a minister will do a press release, and everyone will think that the day has been saved. So I said to him, however, if you want to go back to the entire region and you line up every mayor of every municipality, every chamber of commerce, all of your 26 universities and 200 high schools, every one of your regional tech centers, you line up everybody, thousands of people, come back and we'll talk. Now, I say that because they don't come back. This guy came back. Once in a while, someone comes back. I was shocked. He said, everyone's lined up. Took months. So we went in and worked with them. They had thousands. You can see there's some good articles in Fast Company and Price Waterhouse Strategy in Business. There's films on this. They created thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs and new tech parks, and the universities became clinical learning environments in the high schools. They did this. Now, there's nothing special about this. They did it on a socialist and then a Republican premier. because it was local, it was bioregional. They believed in themselves, and we could bring in the talent, but they had talent. Most every region, not every, has the talent.
Next shadow, Jeremy, and something we've touched on quite a lot so far. So basically, there's a very big concern about the influence and spending power of this increasingly concentrated capital that we've already mentioned several times. It's tied up in large banking consortiums. It's tied up in these mutual funds, often separated by two levels, because not only are the shareholders not actually the individuals themselves, therefore they're disinterested in what the company is doing, but we're talking about a second layer of separation because they're invested in a mutual fund, which is then invested in stocks and shares. So we have sort of two levels of separation from what the companies are doing. Often these mutual funds are deeply vested in the old fossil fuel infrastructure. We've spoken about it already, the large energy, water, pharmaceutical, agricultural arms conglomerates. How can governments like the French, the German, the Chinese, these other ones that you've been engaging with on these solutions, how can they create well-being-led budgets and policies that rely so much on multinational tax revenue and employment when they're stunted in the long term by these short 4-year election cycles? They're already crippled by debt owed to these banking consortiums. What possible motivation do those large corporations, these non-human, solely profit-driven capital holding entities, what's their interest in getting on board with this? I'm going to slightly anticipate your answer. I think it's what you mentioned earlier about the fact that they can see it's a dying paradigm, right?
Yeah, that's it. The market speaking. Our group was made up of companies. Many of them they're Fortune 500 companies. Many of them, so like Siemens and Daimler and Schneider and AXA, and they're all over the place. They're trying to do this. All right. So what I would say to you is that the market is there, and the pension funds they're gotten out, they're looking for scale projects. That's 42 trillion. Karl Marx would never have understood pension funds. The workers are the capitalists. They just have not controlled their money. Okay. So now they want to invest in green bonds and green banks at the regional level to get long-term returns. The insurance companies are the ones really hurting because of climate change, right? They insure all this. They're stranded assets they're insuring. They want to be able to move toward the new technologies. So there's going to be a role for some really important companies, some high-tech SMEs, many global Fortune 500 companies here. But ultimately, the decision-making will be at the regional level. But it doesn't mean that we're not going to be global. It's Glocal, because we live on one planet, and everything we do affects everyone else. Solar and wind, you generate it in one part of the world, we're going to share it in another over time zones. It's already starting. Global energy internet, we introduced that in 2000. It's now here. It's going to go across oceans in 10 years. We're going to be sharing lots of things. We're going to be sharing 3D printing in terms of all of the software that can be shared across the world and provider-user networks. Edge data centers are going to be everywhere. It's not decentralized. It's distributed. It's global. But edge data centers, you can move those platforms locally and regionally, but you're also going to connect into global sites like the solar and wind energy internet, and mobility and logistics internet will be global, where you share ideas across regions, but each region is also distributed, not decentralized, distributed. It's a big difference. All right. So, you know that years ago, the commons argument emerged around the same time as Eleanor Ostrom in the civil society. Where was it? The region in South America that had participatory budgeting, one of the regions in South America. But we had already begun to see the civil society starting to move into these areas. Well, in participatory budgeting is everywhere. Cities use it now, not a lot. States use it, where the public acts as a jury, and they sit down with the local political authorities. And over a year, in these assemblies, these citizens' assemblies, they determine their priorities for the budgeting, the actual budgeting. And they're doing this in other areas as well now. This is in cities all over the world. It hasn't scaled to what we want, but Paris uses it, New York uses it, Chicago, it's all over the place.
You're saying that the profit motive alone which is obviously the only thing that really motivates these legal entities, these non-human entities in the form of corporations, the profit motive alone is enough to have shifted all of that capital investment in these mutual funds, their interests. So they are literally sucking the market in the direction of the kind of solutions you're talking about for purely profit motives.
What I'm saying to you is that the local regions, whether it's the state of California, I'll give you a good example of what's really pushing it. So recently, General Motors made an announcement that shocked everyone. And of course, they're out of Detroit, Michigan, the auto capital. And they said, we're now moving all of our electric F-150 trucks to Kentucky and Tennessee. These are red states, totally red states. And that means 11,000 jobs in a whole new industry, okay? And why did they move there? Because Kentucky and Tennessee, someone should tell President Trump, former President Trump, these are red states. Because those states gave them away all sorts of advantages and credits and loans because they wanted those 11,000 jobs, okay? They wanted those jobs for their people, all right? Now, what's interesting about it is F-150 trucks are the second biggest consumer item in America after iPhones. Who owns those trucks? Mainly people that vote Republican. F-150 trucks, they're now going electric. And once that happens, it's very interesting what happens when this happens. The people in those states begin to think in terms of a different kind of approach to what the planet is they live in, because they understand, is the sun shining today? Is the wind blowing when I drive this car, in this truck? How does the energy I use affect its coming and going over the seasons? They become aware of it through their jobs. This is happening. We did the plan for San Antonio, Texas. It's the sixth largest city in the United States. And the chairman of CPS, they're 1/3 of the revenue of the city. They used to be this utility. It's the biggest public utility. And the chairman of that utility came to us in 2009 or 10. They said, could you do a plan? He said, we'll work with you. So they were looking at two possibilities, nuclear or wind. And which one did they want to do? And we said, look, if you go nuclear, our history of this is, and these are companies that in our group that have worked in those areas, you get cost overruns, and they can be billions. And in a sense, you're the cash cow for the city, and you're 1/3 of the revenue. This could bankrupt the city. May not, but that's what's been the trail. If you go to wind, you don't have that liability. So what they found out right in the middle of our deployment there with them is that the two companies that were supposed to develop the nuclear for them, the first two since 3 Mile Island, they were overrun by billions of dollars. We got them out with $1 billion loss, and we brought them into wind. Why is that important? Then the ranchers across Texas spread the word to the ranchers and farmers across the entire Western belt, all red. They're all putting wind turbines on their land because they get, or they're leasing them, they get $100,000 for each lease, and they created cooperatives. In the prairie states, they said, well, we'll negotiate with the companies, but in terms of having an advantage, we'll put all the ranches and all the farms together, and as cooperatives, we'll make the deal on our terms.
It's way beyond politics, if it's logical.
Traditional politics, but it's smart common sense. Every wind farm, if you just lease it, is $100,000 for a rancher or a farmer. So what I'm saying to you is this is what we're seeing, and we've been doing this for a while now, for 25 years now. Yeah. This is what we're seeing on the ground. This is happening. So you go to those prairie states, all red, they're wind turbines as far as you can see on cooperatives, okay? They're making the game because it's their land. The sun and the wind are everywhere. And so if some big company wants to use that, they're going to have to pay the price, cooperatives.
Jeremy, on the subject of corporate power, I couldn't help noticing that following your work with the European governments on the third industrial revolution solution, the director of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, wrote a book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution, promoting very, very similar smart digital solutions. What exactly is the difference between his vision and yours, if any? And do you see his move as a help or a threat to your desired outcome?
I'm smiling because I wrote him a little note afterwards. There's no fourth industrial revolution. It's all about AI and digital technology and algorithm governance. So he said, well, maybe the third industrial revolution was about IT, but we're now moving into genetic technologies, biological technologies, and all of that. No, it's all part of an AI revolution that began a long time ago with the internet, communication internet. I think he wanted to declare something new, and I think it was more of a marketing thing. I don't know, but there is no fourth. It's all about AI, and it's all about algorithms and big data and governance and small data. All the things I've talked about with you and I think the third industrial revolution. What we're learning is that these infrastructure revolutions in history take on their own life that we don't anticipate in advance. That was the biggest surprise. So what we have found after it's been about 20 some years, 25 really on this, is that the infrastructure is metamorphosing in ways we did not expect. And we believe that the third industrial revolution infrastructure, and I'll give you an example of some of the things we found because it's quite fascinating. This is a list that we made up of all the things that we saw after the fact as we started to emerge with this technology. We're balancing now efficiency now against adaptivity as a time value. We're balancing growth now against flourishing. Flourishing is the nature's time value. We're balancing finance capital. Now we realize it's ecological capital that creates it. We're seeing that that GDP is not as relevant as quality of life indicators in determining the well-being of society. We're moving from negative externalities to circularity in our systems. We're moving from seller-buyer markets to provider-user networks. We didn't see that at first. We're moving from linear processes to cybernetic processes. We're balancing corporate conglomerates with high-tech, small and medium-sized cooperatives, SMEs. We're balancing intellectual property rights with open source sharing of knowledge. It's quicker. We're balancing zero-sum gains with the network effect. Biosphere politics is now being balanced by bio-regional governance. This goes on and on and on. We didn't see all this at the beginning. These infrastructures take on their own persona. And what I would say is by the late 2040s, if we can move there, the third industrial revolution will have finally morphed into the first of the age of resilience infrastructures for the next couple hundred years.
Coming back to the World Economic Forum for a moment, do you see them as aligned with the European Union in terms of what he's proposing, or do you see it as a move from big capital to try and wrestle back some of that influence in the transition?
Well, what he's talking about, AI, I'm in favor of AI, but how do you use it? All right. AI is going to be important for infrastructure. Absolutely. Absolutely. When we're talking about IoT sensors, when we're talking about edge data centers, when we're talking about how you move communication, energy, mobility, logistics, we're going to need
lag
AI.
time. You mentioned lag time. Yeah.
A latency factor, all of that. Will we have to use it more sparingly when it comes to using chatbots and stuff? It can be used, but there are limits to that. And that's because all the data that you collect is immediately old, right? And it's also when it's also selective. And the butterfly effect at every moment changes everything because this planet is evolving as patterns and processes moment to moment. Now, really moving quickly because of the hydrosphere is rebelling, the floods, the droughts, the wildfires, the distribution of groundwater. So the idea that this past data is going to be the answer to everything, no. Will it be useful for some things? Absolutely. I like the fact that the GRACE system satellites up there are telling us about what's going on moment to moment in terms of the planet. I like the fact that we have IoT sensors, for example, in the wild to monitor how our fellow species are doing on climate corridors. I do think we have to use AI probably more in logistics in the infrastructure itself and rely more on common sense in the human mind at the local level on how they make decisions of the kind of way they want to treat their common bioregion, their commons. That's citizen science. You learn by doing. It's more adductive, it's more pragmatic science that emerged back 100 years, but now it's very sophisticated. So I hope that's helpful, but I mean, that's kind of where my thinking is.
Absolutely. Like, it's been really wonderful. This second part of the conversation, I expected to take a little darker turn as we saw the sort of usual suspects kind of sort of rearing their ugly heads to just try and sort of suck and extract as much out of it in the very much, the Francis Bacon way that you quoted so beautifully.
He called Earth a common little harlot. He was a strange guy. I'm not naive. I'm guardedly hopeful, but I realize this is the biggest crisis we have ever faced. This is an extinction event. That means half the species on the Earth may not be here in the lifetime of today's children. They've been here for millions of years. It's changing everything. And it's all about the hydrosphere here. So what I'm saying is that I know what's possible. I know what's available. We are there with that. The question will be, will we come up to the challenge quick enough, a younger generation? Will we do the heavy lifting? Will we change our educational system? Will we begin to introduce all of these ideas in academia? Can we begin to encourage a younger generation to be prepared for the new kind of business models? Can we begin to move our universities and high schools and grade schools into interdisciplinary studies? So instead of specializing, we learn that everything's interconnected with everything else, and our studies from grade school on and have to be interdisciplinary. So we have an overall concept and framework in which to make decisions. We need a much more sophisticated approach to how we educate ourselves. All of this, the age of resilience was interesting for me to do because it's clear the age of progress is over. That's a 6,000-year journey, all the way up to the fossil fuel industrial revolution, the Enlightenment, the age of progress. And what struck in my mind when I wrote The Age of Resilience is that it's kind of interesting to me, at least. What hit me is that whole approach, the Enlightenment, the Age of Progress, a 6,000-year trail up until recent times, it took us to the extinction event, and we're trying to use the same set of principles, the same assumptions, the same worldviews that gave rise to this crisis, the Age of Progress, to cure it. So if you look at the UN, I love the UN, but you look at the UN, the World Bank, the OECD, the IMF, they're trying to develop mitigation strategies and now a little bit of resilience using the same set of ideas and assumptions that gave rise to it, how we conceive of nature, our approach to education, how we govern ourselves, how we organize our economic life. But all of that is a stranded asset because it's taken us to the crisis. So I wrote The Age of Resilience because I wanted to put together this a completely different narrative here that's emerging. And the book just tells that story. But unfortunately, that story is not widely known.
Yeah, my next question was about this idea of uniting as a species, which may come through our consciousness in a sort of biophilia and that sort of emergency-led collaboration. It's like, well, okay, we're under threat here. We're a species at risk of extinction. But in order to do that, we're going to need eventually a world government of some sort, or at least a United Nations that can make legally binding decisions and laws, right? But how on earth do you do that? And ensure such an organization doesn't then get hijacked by already grossly unequally distributed capital influences?
Well, look, nation states have had a 200-year reign, and they're not going to disappear tomorrow morning. In some places, because of climate, there's going to be places where people are leaving. And we're talking about the next few years, not the next few decades. Having said that, I mean, we are moving, there's going to be a mass nomadic migration over the next 20, 30 years, not in the next one. It's going to happen. It's already happened. There are millions of people now in the Mediterranean who are taking, and they're trying to get those boats over to Europe. There's a huge amount of populations in Central and South America trying to get over the border, moving north. So what I would say, when you keep talking about a global institution, I think you're going to see a lot more bio-regional governments globally interacting around the world to share best practices and to work with each other on commerce and trade. The nation states many of them will continue. Some will just disappear because of climate.
And you think the United Nations is in a state to field that kind of large community of glocalized
It's
organizations?
too small. And what we need is something big. And big is thousands and thousands of bioregions who share common systems to begin working with each other globally all over the world to share best practices and work together in sharing energy, communication, mobility, logistics, and the hydrosphere.
And that's
So what we need is something more powerful than the UN or the OECD or the IMF or the World Bank.
Like what?
We need nation governments are not going to disappear overnight. We need bioregional extension of those governments. We need citizens' assemblies. We need political boundaries to be shared over common ecosystems. That's happening. We've got 2 big bioregions in the U.S. right now, massive. They would be the 4th or 5th largest economies in the world. I mentioned that. We have it starting in China with 8 ecoregions. We have it starting in Europe. So what I'm saying to you is the power comes from a distributed global power.
Absolutely.
It doesn't come from a centralized power because not much gets done.
And Jeremy, you've been very, very generous with your time. I really, really appreciate you going the extra mile for us because these are such sort of complex and detailed subjects. I really appreciate the extra time. Now, I just want to close with one last important idea. Again, coming back to these sort of non-human corporate entities being the only winners in our current system. I do like the idea that it is a defunct system and that it is on its way out. But for now, it's very much still the only winners. And the poet...
It may be on its way out. We don't know.
Exactly. It's up to us, isn't it?
I hope that we are changing.
The poet Ginsburg described this in an allegory with the Old Testament story of the deity Moloch, who received human sacrifices from its worshippers. And Moloch represents the corporations, and its worshippers, the human representatives of those corporations. They choose bad options for everyone, which otherwise they wouldn't choose, because if they didn't, their competitors would use them to beat them in the market. And this then slowly devolves into a sort of race to the bottom as ever worse options are chosen, because if we don't, then the competition will. We saw this in the first and the second industrial revolutions. We saw this in the nuclear arms race at the Second World War. And as the physicist Max Tegmark, a huge fan, and the sociologist Daniel Schmachtenberger have pointed out recently, we see this again in the current race to artificial general intelligence, blind race. Do you see the third industrial revolution as a way to sort of remove Moloch as the only winner in this game and once and for all just put the service provider, the end user, on this same lateral integration scale once and for all? Or will we just be permanently battling in the shadow of Moloch, never truly serving the collective good alone?
Well, what's interesting about human beings is that we never know what our species is going to do. Life evolves in very, very interesting ways. I'll share with you something that I think comes to this. So Edmund Burke, the philosopher, came up with an idea during the Enlightenment that was kind of interesting, called the sublime. The sublime, all right? And what he said is that when an individual human being is confronted by an overwhelming event, like a volcano or an earthquake, or just a huge mountain range looming down, or a geyser, or whatever it is, their first reaction, if they're far enough away and safe, is to say, "Oh my God!" First terror, and then if they're far enough away in a safe place, it sparks their sense of awe. Wow, what is this? This is amazing. Then their awe leads to wonder. Well, what is this about? The wonder leads to imagination. And then at that critical point, what happens? Immanuel Kant said, well, when you get to that point, first the terror of the planet being so overwhelming and us so small, all right? And when you first come to that awareness, it does pique awe, and then imagination comes in, and wonder, then imagination. Then Kant said, then the superior reasoning of our human beings comes into play. And because we're rational and detached, and we are able to use deductive reasoning, we can then take that experience and we can mold it into a utilitarian way to advantage our species. All right. So Arthur Schopenhauer came along. He was the nemesis at that time. I'd love to have had dinner with him. He was a good friend of Goethe. They used to hang out together. So, so what happened is at one point, I think it was the Danish Royal Society ran a contest on, is this the right way to proceed? And the only, Schopenhauer put in his essay, and he was the only one, but they denied him the prize. But let me explain why. Schopenhauer said, that's not what happens. When you have a sublime, yes, when nature all of a sudden looms in its overwhelming presence and you feel much smaller and it's much bigger and you're like, oh my God. But then, you're right, he would say to Burke, then it leads to a sense of awe. What is this thing that I'm a part of? Then it leads to actually wonder. And when wonder opens up imagination, he said, that's where I differ from Kant. He said it can go another way. And that is when we begin to perceive this, it's also a part of human nature that we begin to realize that we're part of something much bigger. And we are an agent among all of the other agencies of this planet. And we're part of a unity, a living organism, this earth in which we live in. And we identify with it. And it's not because we seek power over it or utility. It's because we feel of one with something called life, which we don't think exists anywhere else. And the life force of this planet is the most incredible experience anyone can have. Every species should have. I don't care who they are. Species need their lives, okay? We could use a few less viruses, but they play a role. Every species needs their moment. And so what he said is that Kant got it all wrong. It's not rational, detached, deductive, inductive reasoning. He says, really, what happens is that when we experience something like this, or when we experience someone else who is scared or frightened or feeling that they have no way to respond, he said that's where something else kicks in. And he called it compassion. When we see somebody that is terrified or frightened or scared or not able to believe that they're going to exist, that can lead to a compassionate embrace where we reach out from ourselves and we actually feel that other person just like we are feeling ourselves. It's not up here, it's on the entire body. We can feel their dread, but also their happiness as if we are experiencing, even though we know it's not. He called it compassion, but it was the first actual good definition of empathy, which emerged as a term 100 years later. And he said, that's what makes the human race so special, all right? So what I would say at this moment in history is that there's a contradiction in history. We want every one of us, depending on our philosophical or religious or whatever tendencies, we in our own lives we seek universal intimacy, which is kind of a contradiction.
So if the tipping point is passed, if capital is on board, there is absolutely no reason that this couldn't be, it couldn't replace our recent tendencies towards a much, much better solution.
Well, sure. And for sure, pension funds are waiting. That's 42 trillion. The insurance funds are waiting. That's 22 trillion. The green bonds and banks are waiting. What's holding this up is a political will at the local and state and national and global level that's old, that goes quarter to quarter, and is sucked into the moment-to-moment press releases that they have to put out, and that's what has to go. The way that goes is by a younger generation saying, okay, and it started, we're going to come together in our communities, we're going to share our common ecosystems, we're going to move into these technologies that are distributed, we're going to work together, and that's how we get over the idea that everyone speaks in many languages. That's how we trust each other by physical contact, eye to eye, in our regions, facing the same crisis on climate. And that's how people know truth, by being together with citizens' juries, citizens' assemblies, citizen science groups, the local school systems, and all of the stuff on the internet that's telling us all these lies. Once you get into the local region, where you have to have everyone working together, citizen science, citizen juries, the educational system, the local businesses, they see each other day to day as human beings. That's where the cooperation and the empathy comes in. They know each other as families. They cross political boundaries and share common ecosystems. This isn't some theory. I've never believed in these nice inductive and deductive theories about how the world should work. This is like common sense. This is pragmatic common sense. So I think where we're at is, can we get there? Maybe. Will it be a totally different world? It already is. Will we have to rethink everything? Yes. Are we capable? Can we move to a more sophisticated bio-regional, glocalized governance? Yes. Can we begin to share the bounty of this planet, not in a utilitarian way, but in a way that stewards the commons? Yeah. And if this were 20 years ago, none of this was happening, I'd say no. But now the market's there, the technology's there, and a younger generation now is starting to get there, but they have to roll up their sleeves and really move into hands-on. They're starting bio-regional governance, and they got to start to be elected to offices. They got to get into the local SMEs and businesses. They got to teach the younger generation. They've got to do their homework. And what I would say to every young person that might listen and watch this podcast, there is no easy way here. It's doing the homework. It isn't just going out to protest or to have one day, a year where you have some kind of a get together with government. And what I would say is I'm seeing that happen, but it's not scaling fast enough.
Well, Jeremy Rifkin, it leaves just for me to thank you on behalf of the listeners for taking us deep into your vision, and to thank you for so many years of service to actually bringing this to top-level organizations, China, US, American government level into reaction, and going even further down the line into getting on board the local governments, getting on board the universities, getting on board the power and energy companies and the big tech companies. That is the level of interference and disruption that is required at this point to get this going fast enough. Jeremy, I can't thank you enough for your work. What a legacy. And thank you for your time on Chasing Consciousness today.
And thank you. Let's move from the age of progress, which is dying, to an age of resilience, which is our future, and a future for many, many thousands of years to come, hopefully.